So many of us are interested in bringing the spiritual together with the secular, or just the mundane, the spaces where we live, the cities with which we have to deal with, the governments that rule over us, or perhaps we rule with. But one of the problems with trying to bring those two together, or even, as my guest will discuss, blurring the divine between them, is we aren't often quite clear on what the spiritual actually is. And that's one of the things that we'd like to talk about today. What does it mean to be spiritual? What sorts of things are spiritual? Because only once we figure that out can we actually figure out how that might be connected or interlaced with the secular. Welcome to the Sanctus Forum. I am Michael Stewart Robb, better known as Mike, and I'm here with James Catford. Say hello, James.
Hi there, good to see you.
I'll introduce him in a second, but just so you know, this is a longer conversation about Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy, the so-called conspiracy conversations. And it is so long that you might get very tired of looking at our faces and want to go over to the audio-only podcast. And that does exist if you look up the Sanctus Forum in wherever you look for podcasts, wherever you listen, and you will find us and you'll find all of the past conversations that we've done. Today, we are doing one on, well, it's in chapter 3 of this book, and I've forgotten the title, so I'll just have to look it up. All Things Visible and Invisible is the title of it. And we'll be talking about what spiritual reality is. Now, before we get to that conversation, Sanctus Forum is sponsored by the Sanctus Institute. The Sanctus Institute is interested in creating everyday spaces for theology and spiritual formation in Europe. Now, especially if you live in Europe, an invitation to go over to sanctus.institute and sign up for our newsletter, which comes out almost monthly, really, when I have the opportunity to write it. While you're there, you can also look at a section called Friends. Sanctus is a charity, a nonprofit, and we're held up by prayers and faithful givers. And for those faithful givers called Friends, we have this year a book called Something to Say, a comprehensive bibliography of Dallas Willard. It is what it says on the tin, so it tells you all of the things that Dallas Willard wrote and spoke and everything that we have record of. And you can get a free copy of that if you live in America, the United States of America, and Europe. Fortunately, we still need to figure out how to get it to other places. But do check that out and learn how to be a friend of Sanctus. But that's all the housekeeping that I had. James Catford is my guest today, and James is not only an increasingly old friend. He's been helpful for me because James was once an editor here in London, where he's lived for quite a lot of his life. I don't think he's an original Londoner. You're not, are you?
Nearby,
yeah. Okay. And as an editor, he's helped me figure out how to put together things like this and talk with publishers. He's gone on to work for the Bible Society, the British version of that. And after being the executive for them for nearly 10 years or something like that, over 10 years, he stepped into a role of being a leadership coach for a lot of the Bible study societies around the world, as well as other groups that are in this intersection between the spiritual and the secular, right? James is also the chair of SPCK, which is a major publisher in the British market, and I guess you send things to America and Australia as well, right? And he is a great guest to talk about how to get. This sounds really cheesy, but how to get more spiritual. That's terrible. I shouldn't say that. But bringing together the spiritual and the secular. And we have a very interesting section before us here, James. Not an easy one, I think, unless you love doing philosophy of mind and philosophical anthropology. This could be a little difficult.
Well, you may say that, and I think it's probably true. My interest really is in bringing it down to the practical everyday, and you mentioned in your introduction the everyday.
Yeah.
Trying to bring all of this into the everyday. So you'll find in the conversation we have, I'll be steering us in that direction. You can go as high and philosophical as you want to go, but I'll be saying, let's go down to the realities. I mean, my journey has been to tread this line between the secular and spiritual, the Bible and the culture, faith and reality around us. And whenever I'm on one side of that line, I kind of think, oh, I wish I was on the other side. When I go to the other side, so my career has been working for publishers in the secular space, in inverted commas, and in the political world, the public square. So I'm really interested in, does it work?
Yeah.
Does it work? Does it have, you see, often people talk about is our faith relevant? And that's a good word, but I'm really interested in credibility. It's the credibility of what we talk about that I'm interested in, which is why the section we're going to explore, we've got to take it down to where it hits people and where it's actually at in life.
Yeah, yeah. And yet you're also quite interested in, the practical for you isn't just life at home. You're pretty close here, central London, to Parliament's not far away. London being a major arts hub for the world. It's all around you here. So these are some pretty, humanly speaking, elite circles that you're interested in seeing. Let me ask you that. What would you like to see from government and the arts or education?
Right. Well, it's elite in the sense that these are, there's probably people who are stars and powerful individuals. So yes, Parliament is just over here. But broadcasting's here, the media is here, the BBC is here. There's a whole entertainment culture, which is very where people are at. Journalists, it's not just highbrow journalism, it's the, streetwise, it's the everyday. Just heard a siren go by. I mean, this is the culture I'm in. So we are trying to work in that space, because if Christ is real, if Christ works, he works here. This has to play out here.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to be careful we don't just have a privatized faith. It's
Yep.
Jesus deep down in our heart.
Yeah.
True, but it's also a Jesus out there
Yeah.
in culture,
Yeah.
influencing it. And we need to build the confidence of people that they can be a follower of Christ in the toughest environments, in government, in arts, in entertainment, in these different worlds, and not go, oh no, they're too hostile, they're too frightening, because they're not, and people are searching, spiritually in those areas.
Yeah. Most of us are on the, let's say, receiving side of government, arts. Very few of us have worked in education. We're the ones who are educated,
Right.
and that's so. There's a sort of concentration of power, I suppose, to these areas, and most of us, Parliament's never asked me what I think about a particular public policy or a particular law, and yet I live under the laws of governments all over the world, and well, for me particularly in Germany. Which are you more interested in seeing how do we put this, a blurring of the divide between the spiritual and the secular?
Yes, you picked up on that word, blurring. I'm trying to say that, Richard Foster said once, he used his hands as an illustration. He said, as a young person, I was taught that you kept the spiritual away from the world as much as you possibly could. That a God should be kept over here, and the world is over here. So over here is retreat, it's study, it's withdrawal, it's silence, it's getting out of things. Over here is the dirty world of cash and spending and euros and so on. It's music and film and all these things. And the really spiritual people keep them as far apart as they can. And then he said, and I remember as a young person, well, I was younger than I am now, he said to me, as he said, now I realize that the truly spiritual people are the people who don't keep them as far apart, but can see how they integrate, how they critique each other, how that conversation happens between the two. And that's what I meant by blurring.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they are the same, but they live in the same space, or they ought to.
Okay, well, let's try, with the help of Dallas Willard, who may not have all the answers on this, try to figure out how those two can come together, be in conversation. What do you pick up on, and, what do you pick up on as the most, as Dallas Willard's contribution to this question of the spiritual? Where do we find that in our world?
Well, I think he makes the point, and anybody who's read the material or read him or even heard him speak, you don't have to listen to him a great deal before you come across him saying that everyone is spiritual. There's not a spiritual person and an unspiritual person.
Right.
And I'm always interested in the way people speak. Says, this isn't a very spiritual thing to say, X, Y, Z, or they're not a very spiritual person. You go, really? Really? Well, let's see about that. So I think there's a whole issue around what does it mean to be high spiritual. And I'm intrigued by a comment he has, which is that his definition of spiritual, which many people raise an eyebrow over. He says everything that's not physical is spiritual.
Yeah.
Now that people, and immediately I get people saying, no, I don't think that's right. I mean, I wonder what you pick up as people say that.
Yeah. That's pretty exclusive statement. So you might wonder whether some things like numbers numbers aren't physical, but are they spiritual, therefore? I think what, maybe Dallas didn't say it as elegantly every time, but what he's getting at is one of the characteristics of spiritual is that it isn't physical. Doesn't mean that everything that's not physical is spiritual, but that one of the characteristics of being spiritual is that it's not physical. In his famous definition of spirit is unbodily personal power.
Yeah, and that
so
comes
that
up,
unbodily part is, he calls it in this the negative.
Yes,
he says when we say
negative.
that it is personal, when we say that it is the personal that is the spiritual, we mean negatively. That the spiritual is something not perceivable by any one of the five senses.
But I think that as soon as you chisel something in stone, you take a piece of rock and you start to carve it, you're adding something spiritual into it, because you're making some choices, you're taking a view about it. And architecture, for example, which is a big public statement, is saying something, and it's saying something about the way reality is and the whole spiritual world.
Right. Oh, that's very fascinating, because the laws of physics or of chemistry don't create the buildings that you see in a city like this. Those are created by spiritual beings.
Yeah.
Now, there's an interpretation of what human beings are that says, well, we are just a bunch of molecules crashing into each other, and things hit my brain in certain ways, and therefore I think this is the way that a building should be created. And that's a very deep story for our society at the moment, though it's starting to fade a little bit, I think. Maybe we can talk about the rise of spirituality in Western culture and sort of secularism or materialism, this sort of idea that a human being is just only a bunch of molecules crashing together. Starting to look a little old to some younger generations, not quite like the life that they want or one that they recognize in our world. But you're absolutely right about when we take rocks and start to carve them, or when we start to build them into buildings. We're looking at spiritual reality, or certainly things that reflect back to spiritual reality.
I mean, give you an example in the architectural world, just an example. Take the Barbican, which is a big complex built in London. It's got a concert hall, a theatre, the library. It's got apartment blocks and everything else. It's concrete, built post-war. And what's so striking about it is that it is introverted. The entrances into the complex are small, nothing major about them, you just flip in. But the whole architectural focus is internal. It's on what's happening inside. It's building with shapes internally. You take a different architectural period or different architecture, then we could go many examples where the whole point was the entrances. They want the grandest, most public statement to look outwards and to draw people in. Now those in some respects are talking about a spiritual reality. They're trying to express a view. One is an introverted view, an internal view, and one is an outward view, a public profile. Now you can take pieces of architecture around the world, but it's quite interesting to look at a piece of architecture and say, what are they trying to say? What is coming back towards me on it? And those are spiritual issues.
Those are spiritual issues, exactly. In preparation for this talk today, or the conversation, I dug up an old talk that Dallas did on can reason and spirituality be compatible? And then he has a lot to say about reason and knowledge, and basically he's asking, can we know spiritual things, spiritual reality? The knowing being the reason part, and then spirituality is what he's how he is explaining spirituality. And he comes down to give, and I wrote them down here because I couldn't remember them otherwise. He gives 5 areas that he counts as our main encounters with the spiritual. And the first being, and really the most important, is self-awareness. So just being aware of who you are, and this is what he's doing in this book. I mean, he's saying here right at the very beginning of the section, I keep losing my space here, but he says, for me, the second paragraph, and for this we look again to personality as we find it in ourselves. So he's already done that in the previous section, looked at personality to figure out how spirit relates to space, and now he's going to do it again. And what does he start talking about? He starts talking about us being non-physical. He starts talking about power that we have in the non-physical area, and he talks about us thinking and valuing. And then choosing, which is will. That's kind of the main thing he wants to talk about in the very next section.
Sure. So an example of that would be my career was mainly around publishing biographies, autobiographies particularly. So I had a string of biographies. These are recognized people, sports personalities, entertainers, political thinkers, members of the royal family. And they usually were about people who'd had a tough experience, been in jail, had a breakdown, did something awful, and I'd go in and try to get the story out of them.
Okay.
And the reasons why people are interested in, because they're interested in why, who are you? It's personality, to take this point.
Yeah.
We're fascinated by personality and character. And the question is, why is that? Well, because in the understanding here is that personality is a spirituality.
Right.
And so people are interested in that. They think they're interested in people, which they are, but they're interested in what's going on inside, but what's driving them, what is good and true and honest. And that's what we're fascinated by.
Yeah.
So even that, when you say I'm into biography, even that is a spiritual experience.
Yeah, and another example of that, this is not my example, but Dallas Willard's novels, what we take to be a good novel. The interesting parts are the spiritual parts. You can imagine a novel that was only told in terms of the physical, of what was happening physically in life. Be pretty boring. There might be some value to it, but I don't think anybody would not be a bestseller.
Right. Right. No, I agree about that, and I also think. I mean, have you thought, why do these true crime programs? Why are they so successful? Why people love to watch crime programs, reconstructions of crimes, investigation of crimes, murders, terrible things happening to everyone, because we're fascinated as to why. Why did you? Why were you up to that? I mean, people just are, and they're driven by a spirituality. And there's always a moment, if you watch any of these crime shows, where there's a pause. Something's happened, or somebody's said something, or some piece of evidence comes out, and there's a pause. There's they always, you watch for it, there's always a pause where the audience is invited to consider, where something almost transcendent happens in this. How could they possibly have done that to their child, or their parents, or their spouse, or whoever it is? And we're left there to hang. And that's a moment of spirituality, in the sense where the depths of reality, and of course we always want the crime to be solved, or the person to be brought to justice, abstract, but invisible things are real. And whether you believe in God or you don't, we're fascinated and we're drawn into those invisible things, because we want reality.
And I mean, you mentioned justice, and issues of morality are a huge part of human life, and a huge part of what happens in government is a question of morality. What's the best way to treat people? Is this law a moral law, or is it not? And moral reality is a spiritual reality. It's you can't account for it in terms of the five senses, or what you can discover through physical research. So we've got a number. You've mentioned. Well, you mentioned the arts to a degree. You mentioned architecture, and a couple other examples. These are Dallas's examples. The area of meaning. Meaning is not something that we can derive merely out of physical sources, or physical, in terms of physical understanding. And then lastly, you mentioned belief in God, but just anything in the transcendent area. And that's usually what people think of when we start to talk about spiritual. Means, okay, other beings or other things, not necessarily personal, but not humans. And what is that like? How is London doing with its interest in the religious aspects of spirituality? Is there...
Interesting you say that. A number of ways to answer that. I would want to maintain that London, like any city, any society, is having a conversation all the time about spiritual things.
Okay.
Now that's, how can that possibly be? And in one sense, of course, organized religion is pushed to the edges. The Bible and Scripture is pushed to the edges. So someone, Eugene Peterson, said in one of the books, I want to bring the Bible back from the margins of society, of contemporary culture, where it's been so rudely pushed by its more glamorous competitors. It's quite a nice way of putting it. And to establish it as the centerpiece of what is good and true. Now, I think that's right. There has been a pushing to the edges, but I also think that we need to have the eyes to see, as I've been giving examples on, of where it's showing up. So there's a conversation happening all the time about who's a good person, who's got it made, who's honest, how do you become a good person. Now, it's not done in religious language, but we have to go where the language is, but the categories are there. So a tabloid paper will say that murder is evil. Oh, really? That's an interesting term for a society that doesn't claim to have, So where are you getting that from? And those places of the conversation are what I'm interested in. I mean, look at our comedy shows, our satire, our SNL, all of that is people having a conversation about that's dishonest, that's wrong, he's a hypocrite. These are all places where that's happening. We just need to be able to hear the language and enter that. I mean, and one obvious church example, religious example, was the funeral of Her Majesty the Queen, which took place close to
Not
here.
far from here.
I don't know whether it's true that half the world watched it. I don't know.
A lot of people watched it.
A lot of people did. And what is it they appreciated? There's a comic element of it. There's an absurd element of it. I'm the first one to say how absurd it all is. But in the absurdity, there was something transcendent going on. She was a good person. She was a public servant. She expressed permanence. You see, now there's a very interesting spiritual issue. And of course, a lot of people, having watched some of the coverage, isn't it amazing that the Queen and the British were able to concoct, in brackets, an unreal sense of permanence, meaning there is no real permanence, nothing is sure, we can't rely on anything, but they managed to create a fiction around permanence, whereas I'd want to turn it on its head and say, no, that was an expression of a deeper reality, a deeper sense of consistency and permanence. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There is a rock beneath us. There is underneath the everlasting arms. In Christ, all things hold together. I mean, these are deeply rich spirituality, and people go, I love it in the Queen. Isn't that amazing? What a woman. So that's where it's coming out, I think.
Yeah, that's the Queen's permanent stability. I mean, that's an expression of her will, really. That wasn't just a function of, and she could have been, and we've certainly seen that for royal families, just a really volatile sort of personality. Something else came out of her,
right?
And that's what's captures our attention. If a mountain stays in the same place for a long time, there's a beauty to that. But to see a human being sort of remain stable, permanent.
Well, this whole conversation is played out, and I think that art is probably where it's most obvious. Now, people say, no, surely the world of the arts and the media and entertainment and so on, there isn't much faith in there. Well, actually, there's quite a lot, and a lot of the most obvious places. I mean, we see a lot of plays here because we live so close to this, and I mean, it is very difficult to find a play, especially the more kind of creative ones that aren't probing and pressing on the sort of issues we're talking about here. All the issues are coming up. What is love? Who am I? Where do I come from? Where are we going? What's going to happen after death? What is true? What can we hold up to? All these things are being explored. So, in one sense, art leads. If you want to see where the culture's going, where the conversation that's happening all the time is going, it'll show up first in arts. Because they're experimenting, they're probing. We did a series of how much is Jesus Christ coming up in the media, arts, politics, education. Art was where it came up more, references, explicit references to him. So I think we just need to be aware of that. And
are you now? Is that true? That the arts are always leading? There's another interpretation of art and how art functions in human history is that it comes out of a context of an intellectual context, and so you can sort of look at art through history, or you can look at art around the world, and you can see the connections between what leading artists are doing, or those who are the art that sort of is connected with the culture most significantly, and you can see a connection between that and what that culture is thinking, what they take to be of value, what they take to be of. Dallas has an interesting take on this at the beginning of The Divine Conspiracy, where he talks about how pop art is inevitably an expression of the 20th century and the 20th century lack of meaning and the I guess the interest in absurdity, really, because the absurd is all that that we seem to be left with.
Well, it expresses and leads. It's both rehearsing back to us, but the best art in music or in paintings or sculpture or dance, they're all probing. Because unless it's probing and exploring and asking questions, then it's just commercial in the sense of it's more of the same.
Sure. Yeah, I mean that the prophetic role of art is certainly a feature of our day. This sort of standing on the margins and raising questions, calling attention to things that the general public isn't interested in. I do wonder if that's been a feature of art. All good art really does stand out in some way. It's not something that really has to call attention to itself. However, is the prophetic role that a lot of our artists find themselves in, like punk rock music, is sort of calling attention to things. But has that been a standard feature of art in all of its manifestations, or is there something about our age that pushes artists to sort of constantly question what's happening?
I think that's what art is doing.
Okay.
Obviously you've got the commercial. It looks like this. It sounds like this. This new pop band is just really an impersonation of another pop band. So you'll get somebody who's leading in an era, who's asking the really critical questions, and they're giving expression to the questions that others have, and then you'll get a string of copycats.
Sure.
But we all know who the real one is.
Yeah.
I mean, we might enjoy the other ones, but we know they led.
Yeah.
They were asking.
Yeah.
And eventually the next comes and say, well, I'm going to take on those. I'm going to ask questions of that and move things on.
Yeah.
So it's a dialogue is going on.
Yeah.
Constantly take any art form. And I'd say in churches that want to say, we find it really hard to talk about politics, because it's so toxic and so difficult. And I understand that, and I'm very interested in what's happening in the, political public square. But you could the church could speak into some of these areas if they just pulled back a bit from that and started talking in the arts space. Because you can often say things a bit more easily, tell the truth but tell it slant is the expression. Come at it from a different angle, don't go at it flat on.
Sure.
So we can probe and participate in that way.
That is something true about our world, that the arts are one of the few areas, I'm trying to think of another one, that whose authority or voice isn't immediately questioned. People, and I think that's not just a function of the artist always trying to tell it slant, as you say, sort of not hitting things dead on, but sort of going at it in a roundabout way. There's something about our society that's, university professors are we're skeptical of them, we're skeptical of doctors, we're skeptical of lawyers, we're skeptical of politicians, we're skeptical of parents, we're skeptical of all authority figures. However, artists have quite a bit of free rein to impress upon. You see that if you're parenting children or young adults, you realize they really do listen to the artists that they have surrounded themselves with. Whether they listen to the other authority figures is not necessarily the case.
Right. The question is it an authority or not? Is the art an authority anyway? The point often is that the art is expressing what people have. It speaks for them. And obviously there is exclusive art where you have to pay a heavy price to see it.
Sure.
But in pop music or culture music, it's a democratic art form.
Sure.
And if you listen to the lyrics of the rap and the street and the garage and everything else, you'll see they are expressing incredible deep hunger, incredible spiritual longing and hopes. This book we're talking about, the Huxley quote, Aldous Huxley, where he says, most men and women lead lives at the worst so painful, at the best monotonous, poor and limited, that the urge is to escape, the longing to transcend themselves, if only for a few moments. Now that's not just drugs, which of course is often seen as an escapist, but dance music and party, and there's a whole sense of, it's not they're looking for the right things in the wrong places, or sometimes looking for the right things in the right places. But certainly, this all speaks to there must be more. There must be more.
Yeah. There
must be more. Life. What was it in Trainspotting? He says, life isn't supposed to be as good as this. Yeah. Because he has a worldview which says it's all. I won't use the expletive, and he's saying the problem is sometimes it's really good,
Yeah.
but I don't have a worldview that can handle it.
Yeah. There's a lot to talk about there. I guess I'm. So we're still talking about what is spiritual, and we're talking about human beings as spiritual beings and as deeply interested in spiritual topics, and that just being a part of everyday life. And we're talking specifically about how it's a part of the media and the arts that we are a part of, whether that's high art or low art or middle art or whatever.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, Dallas has a section here. This is for me on page 82 and 83. The human quandary is a lot of it, but right before then, the paragraph before that section, he says, he's talking about regeneration, or really the Christian hope for human life, which is that we integrate our life into the spiritual world of God, and therefore our life increasingly takes on the substance of the eternal. And he says, we are destined for a time when our life will be entirely sustained from spiritual realities and no longer dependent in any way upon the physical. And now he's starting to think about, future long after we're gone. But this phrase, we are destined for a time, we really cast this huge vision of what human life is about, the meaning in our life. And then he says in the next section, of course, that destiny flatly contradicts the usual human outlook, or what everyone knows to be the case.
Yeah.
And what that human outlook is basically meaninglessness, right? The idea is all of this, it's not going anywhere.
Right.
There's no glorious future for humanity. Not even a select few are going to be a part of it. It's just... Now, I'm sure you see this as well, but when I look at, I watch a lot of films, and often the best films, the ones that have the best actors, the best creators behind them, directors, writers, and that, are so despairing. They're so despairing. And they just end with a big question mark.
Yeah.
And I interpret that as these filmmakers are expressing their deepest understandings about human life. Basically, it's meaningless. We'll have horrendous suffering. It does not amount to anything other than just more and more pain and misery.
There's an honesty there, and that's why you're drawn to them, because they're being honest. They're doing it very well, but they're very honest. And there's an integrity actually in the film, and that's what I think appeals as well. There's an integrity. You see, there needs to be a conversation around that. Thank you for being honest around it, and we should applaud it. It's often that it's not because of a low ethic, it's a high ethic that people say, there is no alternative, I'm being honest about this.
Right. And honesty is an important human characteristic. It is a good human characteristic. An artist who is a perpetual liar would not... Well, we wouldn't consider them a very good artist. Although I think there are some of those around. But you can be honest and wrong about life.
For sure. For sure.
And that's an interesting thing here with what Dallas is saying about meaning in human history. Is there a glorious future for humanity that we can rely on? Or are some of the loudest and best artists of our world right? And that there isn't one.
That's exactly right. That's the debate.
That's the debate.
Yeah. And that's what we need to be entering into.
Yeah.
And saying, what we need to be doing is we need to be engaging with film or art on its own terms.
Yeah.
Now, this is really important. Often the pressure, and I understand why it comes, an evangelist will say, yeah, I've watched a series of films that, I say, well done, that's really good to hear you've done that. Yeah, and I've just used the best clips that support my evangelistic talk.
Okay.
And I'm not sure about that, actually. I think we'd want to be saying, no, that's not really taking the conversation seriously. It's saying, I can plunder your film because you say in very clever ways something I want to say. Yeah. I think what we've got to do with art, film or anything else, is engage with it on its own terms. If you don't believe that there's any spiritual reality beyond, let's engage with that as it really is, rather than try and exploit a film to feed what we are after.
Yeah. So, okay, you've as an editor, you sort of coach writers, or you certainly tell them to, don't write that. That's crap. Or whatever. So you've been in that role as well, and you're in the conversation with culture and the arts and that. How can we, as people who, so we've taken Dallas Willard's advice, Jesus's advice. We've tried to integrate our spiritual being with God's spiritual being, and we want to let every aspect of our lives become connected with the spirituality, the Spirit of God. And now we're going to step into the public square. We're going to step into the world of arts. We're going to write. We're going to create film. Other filmmakers are creating these kinds of films, or other writers are writing these kinds of books. So what are some practical ways in which we can enter into that conversation in I forget the exact term that you used, in a meeting it on its own terms, unlike the evangelist who's pulling out just sort of clips from it. Right. So what are some ways that we can do that?
Well, I think we do need to listen and learn and try to understand the world from their point of view. How are they seeing the world? Why would you come out with a movie or a song or a piece of art? Where would that come from? Talk to me about all that. And then you can start to probe and challenge, as Dallas was very strong on, is that right? Is there a transcendence? When don't you recognize that there's a spirituality in there? Atheists, we did a survey of atheists a while back. A quarter of atheists have prayed. And you go, really? That's interesting. Talk to me about that. Why is that? Yeah. What was going on there? Yeah. So I want to be having a dialogue with people. And a lot of this revolves around admissible evidence, inadmissible evidence. I mean, a child, a small child, instinctively, intuitively believes in God.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, we can't accept that because they're only a child.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to say no.
Mm-hmm.
Or a popular writer talks about a humanist experience they had. There's a book called Eat, Pray, Love,
Mm-hmm.
huge bestseller, and she has a transcendent experience at an ashram.
Mm-hmm.
In India. It's the most beautifully expressed. Something happened.
Okay.
Now, we might want to say there's more that could happen, and it doesn't mention Christ
Yeah.
in that, but something happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we want to validate people's spiritual experiences, because people are having them a lot.
Yeah.
It's just that they're not in terms or expressions that we want. Now, we often feel, well, I can't accept that because you didn't do the 4 spiritual laws, or it didn't happen in a church.
Okay.
Under my authority.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be saying that something's happening in your life.
Mm-hmm.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Now now perhaps you're looking for this and reality and getting that conversation around what is real. Invisible things are real, and they'll change you. Well, let's talk about that. But we're so afraid of having that conversation about spirituality that we will then reduce the gospel of Christ down to something that we can control. I can decide what it is, and I can say who's going to have it.
Yeah.
But people are walking into the kingdom not on our terms, not in our way.
Yeah.
And Jesus, wherever you draw the line, Jesus is always on the other side of the line. It's annoying, it's frustrating. I wish he wouldn't do it, but he does.
Yeah.
So they're meeting Christ. I'm not saying all these are spiritual experiences are meeting Christ, but they're expressing a longing.
Yeah.
And I think we want to journey with people and help them into this spirituality.
Yeah. All right, let me ask perhaps the same question, but in a little bit more crass way. Isn't going to hell a spiritual experience?
Yeah.
So how would you watch somebody have the spiritual experience of going to hell? It's the crass part, perhaps, you're listening, this is what you said, watching, and you're a part of that conversation, in dialogue with them. But how can we then turn the corner or say, well, would you be interested in something else?
Yeah. You would want to say that.
Yeah.
And you'd hope that your own life, they're saying, I want to be like you. And that they're asking you that question.
Yeah.
So it is a conversation around these basic ideas. What is real? Who's a good person? Who's got it made? How do I become a good person?
Yeah.
All those issues are what people are interested in. Now, if you're moving into a personal one-on-one with a friend or somebody you're getting to know, challenge does come in that. They're challenging you, you can challenge them. And we'd want to, if we love them, we'll want them to move into that place of reality. So I'm not suggesting we say it doesn't matter. I'm not saying everybody's going to get to heaven in the end anyway, so don't worry about it. But Jesus is trying to get as many people into heaven, not trying to keep as many people out.
Right. Right.
So I think that ought to be our emphasis here.
Yeah.
We're trying to get many people in.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's sometimes is a little dated about this book is that Dallas is writing in a situation where it's a kind of rampant secularism. So the 20th century, especially in Western culture, is just so uninterested in anything that smells spiritual. And he's trying to sort of say, well, you're throwing away all this really great stuff, which you actually have a great interest in. So let's back up and sort of rethink the issues a little bit. I think in our day, people might take that point and say, I understand there's sort of very important spiritual conversations going on. We're interested in spirituality. And therefore, Dallas's the section here reads a little like, where have we left the physical? Right? It seems like it's not. He's so interested in clarifying what the spiritual is for us. But what do you think? How would you help Dallas re-say something like this today?
Well, I think it still stacks up. I mean, I think he pulls his punches actually, because people will say to me, well, of course I don't believe in God, and I don't really have a spirit, and I sort of go, really? Because people are more spiritual nowadays, more spiritual, more explicitly spiritual. Whether it's about climate change or the endless programs on the world, the natural world, the life in the Arctic, all these sort of programs, these wonderful programs on animals. So I mean, they are speaking to a depth of something beyond, something more meaningful. These animals are meaningful because there's something more meaningful. So I kind of come back and say, you're not secular, are you? That's so last year. Come on, things have moved on from that secularism. It's spiritual. What sort of spiritual is what is often the conversation. So I want to affirm that, whilst not denying the physical, because and I think what I think is important to emphasize, that he's not saying we must repress the physical. He's not saying that's an interruption, that's an impediment, that's a hurdle. He's saying that it's through the physical that we find the spiritual. Art is oil on canvas. It's sound on cellular. I mean, it is a physical thing. It's an audible. And he talks elsewhere about how God comes to us through the physical. And we express who we are through the physical. It's hardly surprising, because he created all of this. So he's interested in the physical. And because it mediates the spirituality of God and the spirituality of us, we couldn't encounter him directly, or it takes a lot of moving towards it. So the physical world is a mediation of God to us, and of us to him and to others, through music, through art, through the physical. So it's visceral, it's earthy, it's tactile. He's not denying those. There's a chapter in a book that he wrote, the body our primary ally in Christ-likeness. Well, I thought the body was supposed to be a problem, to be overcome. And he's saying your body is an ally. Well, it's a physical thing.
Yeah.
So let's understand the nature of the spiritual and the nature of the physical.
Yeah. I think that's... I think one thing, if you want to understand something, you have to sort of isolate it, right? And so if you want to understand what spiritual is, you have to isolate it from all the other things, okay, it doesn't have anything to do with that, or it doesn't have anything to do with that. But that doesn't mean that you're taking all that other stuff and throwing it away. It just means you're trying to figure out what that one thing is that you are... trying to understand.
Yes. And what it's not. It's the via negative. It sometimes helps to look at this by looking at what it's not.
Right. And looking at what it's not. Yeah. And one of the things that this book, I think, for me always was very helpful in bringing the Christian life into the world that I lived and inhabited. Instead of sort of my work with Jesus or the church being about sort of thinking about some biblical world that really is very, very different from my own. Karl Barth has this phrase, the strange new world of the Bible. And that can be interpreted as we sort of leave reality as we know it to just explore these wonderful things in the Bible that don't have anything to do with where we actually live.
Right.
And the realism of Dallas Willard to sort of say, well, when the Bible talks about this or that, it's talking about that in your world.
It is. That's right. And the Bible was intended for our world.
Yeah.
It wasn't written for them in the sense. Of course, it was, but when God superintended the formation of the Scriptures, which is a whole story in itself, how that happened. He had us in mind. Your age group, my age group, the audience age group.
Right.
It's supposed to play out, but we need to wrestle with it, ask difficult questions of it, dialogue with each other over it. Even the secular world might have something to help us with it on.
Yeah.
So let's handle that. So there's a thought.
James, I think we can keep talking about this for a long time, and I'm afraid that's not going to work. Thank you for inviting me here into your home in London, and I look forward to our next conversation on these topics.
Many thanks.
And thank you to you for making it all the way to the end of this podcast and conversation. If you want more of these conversations, they are all on our YouTube channel or on our podcast. You just have to look around. They all have the same thumbnail. Do look out for this book. This is a way to help us stay in business as well as to help other people, creating everyday spaces for theology and spiritual formation in Europe. And there's that newsletter that you can sign up for. And if you actually are still listening right now, you can actually like this video. You can't usually like a podcast, but you can write a very nice review of a podcast, and that helps us as well. All right, until next time, bye. That's a wrap, yeah. We circled around the topics and came back to them, hit them backwards and forwards, and...
Well, hopefully.
You didn't get to read your
Oh no,
your,
no,
your
no,
poem, your
no.
song.
That's okay.